It's late in the day, and I'm going to touch on the subject of Buddhism, so if you wish to meditate, you may, if you're tired. Thank you. I want to start off from 2 points raised by two of you in your papers. And I was a good boy. I really did read everybody's paper ahead of time, although at the time I wrote my own paper, I had not. The 2 points are this. In Akash's paper, he starts off, I think, partly with this idea of can you find or create or discover a form of indigenous social theory that does not degenerate into nativism? Would that be a rough summary of your position? The danger, obviously, of things falling back into really very negative forms of, in the bad sense of the word, nationalism and so on. Can there be such a form of social theory? Can it be discovered somewhere? And a point that Raewyn also made in her paper, which was, you know, I think in a way we're speaking to the converted here. I mean, I think we do share a lot of the assumptions about the nature of colonial, post-colonial theory. The question is where to go in a way from that, whether there's a constructive path possibly that could lead us into some fresh perspectives. And what I want to do is to talk about what I think is one real case, a case which is obviously economically and industrially in the north, but in many other ways people would consider to be, in a sense, part of the South. I mean, clearly an Asian society. It occupies that ambiguous space, but it seems to me an extremely interesting case through which we could address the questions we're talking about here. Partly for a number of reasons, partly because I think it also helps us to shift the discourse a little bit from the, I don't mean in any bad way, the standard way of talking about these issues into potentially a new space. So this is partly a kind of experiment that I'm engaged in, and I'd be very interested in your feedback to whether that experiment really does lead somewhere creative. Well, why Japan? I mean, for one reason is because I know it rather well. I lived there for 28 years, and so it sort of gets into you after a bit if you hang around that long. Secondly, because it is, as we all know, I mean, familiar, it represents itself as being a highly modernized society. People often talk about being the only Asian society which, if you like, created capitalism, a capitalist economy under its own steam, without aid, without ever being colonized, itself having been through a course of a brief and disastrous period of being a colonizer, which didn't lead very far in Korea, Manchuria, and so on, Taiwan. Yeah? And a society with very interesting social characteristics, including that in one sense, it's a very hierarchical society, but a society in which the concept of class is almost completely absent. So different ways of approaching even the kind of conventional issues of traditional sociology. It's also of interest, I think, because it is a society with a fairly long and deep sociological tradition and with a huge body of indigenous social and cultural theory, most of which, of course, we know is not known much outside the country, largely for linguistic reasons. Because it's the unfortunate situation, apart from Japanologists, and not many of them tend to be sociologists anyway, historians, people working in religious studies and so forth, very few people learn the language. So for all those reasons, I think it does provide us with potential interesting case to talk about the broad issues that we're talking about here in this symposium. It's also a society in which an interesting, I wouldn't call it an ambiguity exactly, occurs, but something which contrasts it in a sense possibly with some Western societies. A society which represents itself at one level as being secular, but at another level is extremely religious in terms of everyday practices and the way in which ideas derived from religion, particularly from Buddhism, appear in social theory and help to inform and structure that social theory. So I'd like to talk through a little bit, just for a few minutes, and tell me when I've spent too much, what some of the implications of this case might be, and as I see it, and then we can perhaps argue about how creative this might be or whether it creates its own kind of problems. As a kind of, I don't like this, if I use the word alternative social theory, always in quotation marks, as hopefully we all do, because that obviously implies that if it's an alternative, there must be some mainstream of which it's alternative to. And I certainly don't want to suggest it's alternative in that way. By alternative, I mean, are there epistemological and other quite radical differences that we can find that might inform in concrete and actually quite empirical ways an actual form of social and cultural theory, and not a purely theoretical one, but one actually that exists. And there's the body of literature which represents that kind of cultural theory. So what would some of those implications be? And I've picked out a few. Maybe Ananti, you're going to provide some more. Let me just run through a few of them. I sort of make a list. But one of the debates that's occurred in Japan itself is whether there can, in fact, be multiple modernities. That modernity is not a uniform practice across the globe, but in fact can be represented by different forms of modernity, different paths of reaching it, and different ways of expressing modernity that do not necessarily converge on some kind of conventional Western model. The same argument, in fact, occurred in Japan when, you remember we all went through that phrase, everybody was crazy about postmodernism, seems to have died out by now a bit. The reaction to postmodernism in Japan was very interesting. It was basically, we don't know why you people are getting excited, because this society has always been postmodern. You want to talk about pastiche, you want to talk about all this stuff, you want to talk about the lack of meta-narratives and so on, but this is the nature of Japanese culture anyway. So people couldn't see why Western social theorists were so excited about something which, in a sense, Japan had experienced over long periods of time. The possibility of there being, in fact, therefore, multiple modernities. How you approach that itself is interesting. As Henrik said, one of my recent books is, in fact, on sociology of art. And, in fact, in the way in which Japanese often approach the question of modernity, there has been a considerable debate in aesthetics, notably whether the notion of modernity in art is a single trajectory. The basis for that was a fear, I think, on the part of many Japanese, that the people who painted, for example, in a way that in any way looked a little like Western painting were copying, as opposed to the idea that there are, of course, all artists, in a sense, copy from each other. There are multiple sources of inspiration, and that Japanese painting was not a fake modernism. It was another form of modernism in art, expressing itself through a different kind of visual language. Okay, so perhaps we won't bring aesthetics, as Stefan, you did a little bit earlier in your paper, into this. In other words, the question is whether, there can be multiple social imaginaries operating. One thing that, again, it leads us off in another direction, but I think is quite interesting question. I think most contemporary Western social theorists don't talk about utopias anymore. If they talk about that aspect, they talk about dystopias. No less, as we're aware, in the broad field of Western social theory, there's a huge body of utopian literature of one kind or another. It seemed to me at first that in Asia, for curious reasons, there doesn't seem to be any parallel to that kind of literature, or very little. Until I began to realize, that living in Japan, that the Japanese social theory itself tended to represent the country as being, in a sense, a utopia. It was itself regarded as, in principle, an ideal society, with some imperfections, but things that could be ironed out with a certain amount of adjustment. Amongst those elements were several, and let me just, again, briefly mention one or two of them, because they've also appeared a lot now in contemporary social theory. You know, environmental sociology has emerged as a kind of relatively new field, right? It's become fairly popular in many places. Japanese cultural theory has always been informed by the idea that the barrier between nature and society, if it exists at all, is very weak. And if you look at the, if you like, indigenous Japanese religion, Shinto, the border is almost non-existent. People can pass into the realm of nature. Nature can pass into the realm of human beings. Gods are often people who passed over in some way. Many of those deities are themselves take the form of an animal of one form or another. The fox, for example, is considered to be a semi-divine creature. Rocks, trees, waterfalls, and places of some kind of exceptional natural beauty or something. Mount Fuji itself is a goddess. Okay, and there's no idea. The idea then has emerged that the struggles, again, that are occurring in a lot of Western social theory to relate society and nature have, in a sense, already been done in Japanese social theory, because that boundary between society and nature was never really apparent in the way in which Japanese understood their place in the universe, in the cosmos. Furthermore, that there are a lot of issues, and a number of times today, I mean, this question about what is, I suppose the way some of you have phrased it was really what, not only the politics of knowledge, but actually what constitutes knowledge itself becomes an interesting question. If you read Japanese social theory, you find that there are issues there which have only very recently emerged in Western social theory, or are not really there at all. For example, sociology of the body is now quite a big issue in Western sociology. But that only dates to when? The 70s, 80s, maybe? Been there in other forms. Some philosophers talked about this earlier, Merleau-Ponty, people like this, brought it into the kind of phenomenological approach to society and so on. It's been always central to Japanese social theory. Likewise, the subject of the emotions as something which are an essential point of the way societies and cultures constitute themselves has been a central idea. With the idea of emotions go a number of areas which I think it would be very hard to talk about in Western social theory at all, such as intuition or dreams, of which there's substantial literature in Japanese social theory. The understanding being that the total constitution of a human being, the philosophical anthropology, if you like, upon which we ultimately base our social theory, has to take into account a number of levels. Emotions, dreams, sleep, intuitions, eroticism, and all of those things are constitutive of the way in which social identity is formed. Something else I find very interesting too is the very weak boundary in Japanese thinking between aesthetics and ethics. And in some cases, in fact, the understanding that they are identical. And any kind of separation between them, in fact, distorts the way in which that philosophical anthropology is constructed. There is then this huge body of indigenous social theory. What is partly interesting about it is the way I think it frames these issues about social being and social nature in many ways in forms that would probably not appear as being legitimate, say, sociology or social theory at all in the West. One of the clues to this, and of course the study of literature, again, tends to be something rather marginal in mainstream sociology, possibly part of the sociology of art or sociology of the arts. In fact, I've certainly found that one of the ways in which you uncover a lot of the deeper structures of society is in fact through its literature. Its literature is not merely an epiphenomenon. It's in fact one of the rather unself-conscious ways in which a culture represents itself. And if you do read Japanese literature, you find that these issues are often embodied there and cross into social theory in indirect ways through a kind of permeable membrane, right? But are seen as equally legitimate aspects of social theory as would be the mainstream issues which have dominated its more westernized forms. Can I have just a couple more minutes? Right. This, I think, has a number of interesting implications. One of these, as I perhaps suggested earlier, is to begin to trace the origin of a lot of these issues of questions in Buddhism as the primary shaping force in Japanese religion. And Buddhism, I think, has given rise to a number of other interesting ideas which, if pursued, might lead us in some very interesting directions. In Buddhism, there is formally no concept of the self. That is to say, there's a concept of the self. The self is not a permanent entity, as occurs in many other philosophical systems. That means that a number of things follow from that, which might be interesting to see how Western social theorists would deal with them, including, of course, the idea of impermanence, again, very deeply embodied in Japanese aesthetics. One thing I've missed this spring is, the cherry blossom period, which, if you're lucky, lasts a week. Right, that's all. But it's not thought that cherries should last a little longer, so we could spend longer looking at them. The whole point is that it's brief. It's a sort of metaphor for the nature of life. It comes, it flourishes, it passes, and that is its beauty and also its pathos. Right. Along with the idea of impermanence is the idea that suffering is an integral part of human life. Not something that can be abolished through any kind of social policy. It can be alleviated in certain kind of ways, but it's a kind of signature feature of human being, of being human, if you like. Therefore, cannot be transcended by the usual social policy kind of means. That is phrasing the question at entirely the wrong level. Another aspect of this might be the idea that the idea of a mind-body distinction is almost completely absent from Japanese philosophy. And again, I think the roots of this, Descartes would have had pretty short shift in Japan. What are you talking about? This is an idea which has really no roots in the culture. And that it's also a culture which is deeply, I think Marcel Mauss would have loved Japan. It's very much today still a society of the gift, quite literally, right? Gift giving is an enormous social phenomenon. Because, of course, what gift giving does is both signal and create social reciprocity. The idea of social reciprocity is very fundamental. I had a student who studied one of the indigenous Japanese psychotherapies, in Japanese called Naikan, which roughly translates as inner observation. If you go for a Naikan therapy, you spend 10 days alone, except occasionally meeting with your therapist, or whatever the right word would be, sitting inside your little screen. And what the therapist gives you each session of therapy, he will come or she will come back and talk to you every couple of hours about what results you have of this, is to think through the relationships you've had in life in terms of what you've gained from those people. People usually start with their parents, they will move on to their siblings, then their teachers, then other significant others who they see as having shaped them. They would not be the person, not be the person you are if you did not acknowledge the shaping power of those things. When I look at kind of Western social psychology texts, which I don't very often, they always have titles like Self and Society. There's somehow you have to put these together. Again, I think in Japanese social theory that is an issue which has no basis at all. It's assumed immediately that the nature of social identity is something created out of these reciprocal relationships in which everybody is embedded. There are monks, of course, in Japanese religious traditions, in Buddhism, there are Buddhist orders of monks. This is considered a little bit odd because the trouble with being a monk is precisely that to some extent you cut yourself off from that bigger sociality, which is thought to be the very formative principle which creates your social identity. So what I'm suggesting here is that at least as a kind of experiment, a kind of intellectual experiment here, if we think through the possible implications of a system like this, I think they lead potentially in interesting directions. I've been tempted by the idea of embodying this in a kind of science fiction novel rather than a sociological text. Imagine a society in which, as some schools of Buddhism teach, there is reincarnation. What does that do to our whole view of the constitution of society, where you're going to come around again, right? And if you follow the theory of karma, of course, it has also interesting implications for concepts of social justice. White male racists will probably be reborn next time as poor black females, and so that's your fault, right? Because you're going to have to learn to live with the consequences of your racism. So in that sense, there is a body of social justice built into this. There are, however, I think also some problems. And one of the problems that people who identify themselves as what in some circles are called engaged Buddhists, that is, say, Buddhists who are concerned to relate Buddhism to social action, to the social mobilization, creating social movements, have struggled with are, for example, the concept whether Buddhism can have a concept of human rights. If you don't have a sense of a permanent self, it's not clear that the notion of rights that's largely emerged as for example embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, really applies. How to struggle with this kind of idea. So I think there are very interesting issues that we could experiment with in pursuing the kind of logic of this kind of social theory by being aware, on the other hand, of potential dangers of this. One is indeed, if you read a lot of this Japanese indigenous social theory, the range is very big. It really does range from the sublime to the ridiculous. At the ridiculous end, you have people saying that Japanese culture is unique because Japanese have bigger brains than everybody else, or the hardware is different, more synapses or something, And there's even somebody had a theory about Japanese having different stomachs. That's why it's had something to do with diet and culture or something like that. I can't remember the details. Some pretty absurd, in fact, even racist ideas, exclusionary, because they assume that Japanese are indeed unique and therefore cannot, in a sense, communicate with other people. it's true that the famous Jesuit missionary who went to Japan very easily, Francis Xavier, when he struggled to learn Japanese, decided that Japanese was the devil's language, that it's impossible for foreigners to learn, therefore, it must have been designed to keep Christian missionaries safely out of Japanese culture. I don't think he was totally right. Maybe he didn't stay long enough, but it takes a little while. There have been other problems as well, whether this kind of approach to social theory is one that by this rather reciprocal kind of concept actually obscures the real differences that exist in the society and lacks a critical edge to think about emergent or existing social problems, including the fact, for example, that Japan is still a very patriarchal society, and it's perhaps difficult to absorb that idea and provide a rational explanation of it within the context of this body of thinking. There are, therefore, a number of these kind of issues that are, I think, would have to be thought through in the context of this. But what my paper, therefore, basically is about is a kind of thought experiment. If you take a real society, not a future one or an imaginary one, which has, in fact, developed its own very distinctive body of social and cultural theory and practice, would that be one way of entering or re-entering this debate, not purely at the level of theory, but by actually rooting it in the experience of a concrete society? So I stop at that point.
Thank you so much. Arigato gozaimasu.
Domo.
And reading our friend John Clymer yesterday, in fact, while being in motion, my first reading of John was in the library in Amsterdam in 2002. Very fascinating essay towards a critique of development sociology. And as provocative and insightful as it was, and reading your essay yesterday was also the same. And to be engaged in conversation with you is also to bring another mode of theorizing. What before our conversation, I just put my hands to John and I said, maybe when we talk of Buddhist social theory, we would have to talk about the mudra of Maitreyi. In a Buddha is noted not only in terms of positioning and posturing, but in terms of gesture. And one of the inviting mudra from Buddha is Maitreyi, the friend. So friendship as a way of being with a society where one is born and when one comes to live, which in a way it goes beyond the usual way of thinking about society, for example, the emic and the etic categories. So when we invoke or when we engage ourselves with Japan, so your being with Japan has been in the modality of a friend, of being in a society, and which suggests that friendship as a multiplex way of being with societies is a way of theorizing. But in our conversation, I wish to begin with a few general themes and bringing these concerns into a constellation of themes, 3, 4. So the first theme would be this way of being with a society, Japanese society. And you have hinted at, for example, the lack of critical edge. But gift, the primacy of gift, and you refer to the interesting possibility that arises by comparing not only Japan and West, but India and Japan. So in terms of a comparative engagement then, a global or what some of us might call as a planetary social theorizing needs to move beyond a kind of comparison of the two, of the familiar, but really be engaged with the triple or the third. But the third here is not just a numerical third. The third really is an entry of a open multiple. It is in that sense that once we bring India and Japan together, for example, the language of class. Interestingly, Tamil Nadu, where I have also stayed more than 20 years, there was interesting debate, in the 1970s, and it was Tamil language does not have a language for class, therefore class does not exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and the point is the issue of categories, that even if there is not a language in a society, the reality, does it exist or not? And the language points to both emic categories and etic categories. So therefore, the issue of class and hierarchy that you are pointing to, so how do we look at that with and beyond language? The emic and the etic issue also could be interesting, because Japan as a society, and it is in a very inspiring way, your representation of Japanese society draws really on the people's understanding of them, in a far greater way. And while reading your work, one does not feel that as if it is just an outsider's observation of Japan. But nonetheless, many other engagement with Japan could be far more, outsider kind of engagement. So how do we reflection on the issue of representation of a society, the actual dynamics of society, in terms of the emic and the etic, and the ways of moving beyond that? Your reference to a new cultural grammar here is very interesting. And speaking about grammar and language, one would then think about that a new cultural grammar which builds upon certain languages, certain ways of being in a society, but that also has to embrace the issue of the limitation of grammar, because every grammatical sentence has a danger of conformity. But therefore, the new cultural grammar that you are pointing to as a kind of a deep basis for theorizing is not just grammatical in a grammatical sense. So what would be that configuration of a new cultural grammar, which is not just a reproduction of a logic of conformity? So let us begin with this set of themes.
You'd like me to respond to some of those, huh? The comparison of Japan and India, I think, is a very interesting one, because obviously in many ways there are huge differences as well. When people talk about classlessness in Japan, they overlook the fact that until quite late in the 19th century, Japan, in fact, had effectively a caste system, as you probably know, during the Tokugawa period, during the period of the shogunate. And many vestiges of that, I think, still exist in all sorts of ways, but they've been subsumed into a new self-image of the society, which is interesting, because you've been writing recently about harmony, and harmony is seen as a kind of prime value in Japanese culture, which at certain levels is very nice. I mean, people don't tend to shout at each other. It's not a noisy, argumentative culture and this kind of stuff. But of course, the downside of that is that the same way, of course, it can occlude real differences, real points of conflict, which have to be subsumed into an image of agreement around things. If any of you ever decide to work in a Japanese university, beware of things like faculty meetings. They go on for hours and hours, because whatever has to be decided has to be a consensus. And you have to walk around and around until you've all agreed about everything. Once you've agreed about it, you better make sure you agree to the right thing, because then it's set in concrete. It's very hard to change afterwards, because officially we were harmonious decision about this, which may in fact, of course, simply paper over real differences of opinion, which were never really allowed to emerge. So I think one of the aspects of that, to raise again two, I think, very interesting different questions, but one is in fact the importance of the self-representation of a society, and I wouldn't say distorting, but interesting implications that has. The current rather right-wing government in Japan, under the prime ministership of Mr. Abe, is bought very much into this soft power idea that Japanese hard power is long over, right? I mean, no more, you're going to recolonize Taiwan or somewhere, right? Even the period of maybe technological, if not dominance, at least penetration is still around, but maybe not as effective as it once was. You look at enormous corporations like Sony, which have declined relatively quite steeply in terms of their share of world market and this kind of stuff. So what you want to project is a form of soft power. And the form of soft power that they've selected as being representative of Japan is the kind of culture represented by comics and the characters that populate these animated movies and this kind of stuff. And that's a little worrying in a way when a culture is representing itself as being basically a collection of comic characters, Pokemon, and all these things, they've gone all over the place, right? I met a young American woman in Tokyo a year or two ago, and we were chatting. She was only in Japan for about a week on a very short tour, and asked what she was doing. What she was doing was visiting sites of popular culture. I said, are you going to go to Kyoto? She said, well, of course, everybody goes to Kyoto. I thought, oh, wonderful, you're going to see the shrines and so on. She said, no, the reason she was going to Kyoto is Kyoto has a museum of comics, right? And the one thing she wanted to see in Kyoto was, now, I find this a bit scary. At one level, number one, that rather limited perception of somebody else's culture, but number two, the fact that culture is representing itself abroad in that kind of way. And one commentator on this, in fact, has talked about this in terms of self-orientalizing. You don't want to be represented in that way by others, but you're prepared to represent yourself through that same kind of medium. You mentioned a number of questions. Obviously, language can conceal as well as reveal what is going on. But you did, I think if I understood you properly, you were raising a question which I think is also a little embarrassing for many, say, Westerners working in another culture. This context, probably in an Asian culture. Critics of Margaret Mead, remember Margaret Mead? Have argued, of course, at some length that her books, particularly about Samoa, for example, are deeply misleading because the poor girl never really learnt the language properly. And people kept misleading her by saying, oh, you know what we're doing, we're doing this, and she would write this down without ever really verifying it. And of course, this became, this wildly popular stuff about adolescent sexuality and how, that nobody had phobias or psychological problems and so on in Samoa, or you get whatever, right? And in fact, she was being quite systematically misled. Now, obviously, that level can happen. But you did raise an interesting question. I don't know how we'd incorporate into our thinking about social theory, which is, in a way, research by osmosis. Is there such a concept? What I mean by research by osmosis is that, indeed, having lived there for a long time, and obviously, I was doing other things. I mean, I'm not carrying out research 24 hours a day. I was eating and shopping and taking trains and, doing things. That actually it's often through those totally informal processes, which you don't think in any way being part of a theory construction activity, that you actually get closer maybe to this deep level grammar, if we can think about it in that kind of way. Can I just give you one example, which I thought was quite funny? I did a book on contemporary urban Japan, and one of the chapters in the is about consumption behavior. And consumption behavior in Japan is very gendered. And quite a lot of the work I did during the research period for that was with housewives, basically, have very complex shopping strategies. They know where the best bargains are. Their day is structured around certain kind of activities and this kind of stuff. I spent a lot of time hanging out with these ladies. And I was with some of my ladies one day in a coffee shop, because they always end up in a coffee shop to talk and, as men would say, gossip, share information with one another. And the conversation turned, as it often did, to how awful men are, right? Particularly Japanese men who are stupid, patriarchal, smoke too much, drink too much, don't come home until 10 o'clock at night, and this kind of stuff. This conversation went on for some time until there was a pause and somebody said, "You're a man, right?" I said, "Well, yes, I wondered when you remember, that I was here." So I thought, what should I do? Should I, be so insulted, or should I think, this is really the key. I'm a really good field worker. I mean, I've not only become native, I've even managed to transcend my gender to the point where the natives had so accepted me that they hadn't noticed I was there anymore. And I'm not still quite sure how to interpret that. I'd like to interpret it in that kind of positive way. But that seemed to be an example of fieldwork through osmosis, or that process was involved not actually, going out and giving people questionnaires, right? It was being there, but being there for long enough to begin in a way to internalize aspects of the culture, to the point where your friends, when you go abroad, say to you, "You're so Japanese." I said, "What do you mean? I'm behaving the same way." I said, No. He said, "You don't notice, of course, because you don't see your body language anymore, right? You don't see the way you're talking about things." I still have a problem in India, because I clear up after myself in cafes. And nobody does this here, of course. Japan, everybody clears up after themselves, right? You take your cups and plates and you tidy up, which, of course, you never do in India. So people think this is a lot odd behavior, but once you've internalized it, it's kind of hard to give it up. But then I'm not sure that was exactly your question. But it seems to me the question of osmosis as opposed to formally structured fieldwork is interesting, because I wouldn't say it solves problems of commensurability and so on, but it does pose them in a different way, I think, than when you're approaching things through more formal kind of methodology. So there are a few thoughts on your thoughts.
Thank you. In terms of Japan and Japan's way of being with the world, and in terms of our concerns with colonial and the post-colonial, therefore, even if the brief interlude of Japan with colonialism, and therefore a trajectory of post-colonial emerging from there, and in fact, one of the problem of the narrative of the post-colonial, that it is too narrow. It is mainly, it gives primal significance to India and the experience of British colonialism and some related, whether it is in Australia or in North America, So therefore, to bring the experience of Japan as a colonizer society and the attended dynamics of the post-colonial emerging from the society, Taiwan and Korea, both Taiwan and Korea, are sites of very important post-colonial critique and transformation, which needs to be put in dialogue with the wider conversation of the post-colonial, as it is very limited. But in a same way, I just wish to bring a couple of themes related to Japan and thinking about society. Now, the issue of language, grammar, and society is, and in your own fascinating work, you have pointed to, for example, how the engagement with language in Japanese philosophy, the Kyoto School, for example. So its engagement with language was a different kind of engagement. And we know about dialogue between Martin Heidegger and Japanese, how Heidegger turned to certain, Japanese thinkers. So that is a starting point of elaborating the issues that you hint at in your paper. For example, the dialogue between philosophy and sociology, the articulation of a different project of philosophical anthropology. So we would learn a little more by elaboration of this kind of trajectory of thinking. For example, both philosophy, which is different from Western philosophy, philosophy of language, and the border crossing between philosophy and sociology, which has created a different kind of philosophical anthropology. And if we relate it to your work on ecological self, and that you hinted, you have written more about it, so that ecological self is the nurturance of a different project of philosophical anthropology. So if you could kindly elaborate a little bit more about border crossing between philosophy and sociology. And the related thought here is also literature and sociology, because the sociology of literature, even if it happens in an inadequate way, there is a distinction between sociology of literature and literary sociology. So maybe in the Japanese experience can point to a border crossing between literature and sociology in a far more interesting way, rather than just a reproduction of a category of sociology of literature.
Ananta asks long questions, okay, but as you will notice, so let me try to disentangle several levels of your question. Okay, where should we start? Do you want to talk about the post-colonial, or are you more interested in the philosophical?
Both.
Oh, right, both. Okay, then. Right, I can answer to both.
Why?
Now, how should I put this? The period of Japanese colonialism, relative to, say, British colonialism, was relatively short. Korea, for example, was from 1910 to 1945. It was really only 35 years, right? It's not really 45 years. No, it's 35 years. No, it was not a long period. The idea of talking about an aspect of Japanese social theory from the point of view of a post-colonial perspective is virtually unknown in Japan. Nobody raises that question. Almost nobody raises that question. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that that period is now an embarrassment. You know, this adventure that was largely based on the idea that, well, all the Western nations were doing this, we should do it too. And after the Russo-Japanese War, where to everybody's huge surprise, of course, the Japanese won, right? That, well, you know, if you can beat the Russians, you know, then we should have an empire as well. It's partly an embarrassment at one level, and partly something else. I think the Japanese would love to be colonists. But the fall of colonialism is the idea that goes back to this idea of Japan as the center of the world, in a way. You know, that the colonialism would therefore take the form not of political occupation of other people, but it's actually it's a form of cultural nationalism or cultural colonialism. I think to expand that concept of the world, or Japanese concepts of the world, would be the way you slowly colonize everybody else's minds, as it were. One of the ways, again, it's not designed for Japan has its religious structure is kind of interesting. So that its statistics mean nothing. I mean, everybody claims to be a Buddhist on Mondays. They claim to be Shinto on Tuesday. You know, it depends what you need to do. One of the features of the sociological landscape in Japan, you may have discovered these, what is something called usually in English new religions. Many of them have their roots in Buddhism, some with their roots in Shinto. Some of these are very, what's the word, evangelical, active in recruiting people. Soka Gakkai, you met some of the people, I think, when you were in Japan from Soka Gakkai, for example, have a lot, nobody knows the exact size of their membership, but it runs into millions for sure. Okay. If you read, some of these movements have spread internationally. Soka Gakkai may even be, I think, in India. I don't know if they have any representation here, but they have moved outside Japan. If you read the literature they produce for the outside world, it's about peace, harmony. You know, after the atomic bombing, Japan is now a culture of peace, dedicated to this kind of stuff. If you read the literature for internal consumption, it's essentially that this is the way in which Japan will colonize the rest of the world. It's through the spread of these new religions. Everybody else will be brought into the fold by this kind of means. So I think the colonial issue is interesting, therefore. So one, nobody talks about it. I mean, historically, people talk about it, but not in terms of social theory. Number two, it's largely an embarrassment now. And number three, I think the embarrassment does conceal the idea that people would quite like to be colonizers, but the world doesn't allow this anymore, right? A very hostile reception. And I mean, Japanese prime ministers have been to countries like Indonesia, where you just were, till quite recently, did get a very hostile reception. Memories of occupation and the greater East Asia prosperity sphere and so on are still there. So that's part of the answer to that. The question of philosophy and sociology, I think one feature of Japanese culture is that boundaries are very porous. And this takes many interesting forms. People, I don't know, I mean, I was educated in Britain, and a couple more minutes, educated in Britain, where I think the boundaries are much stricter. I mean, you're in philosophy or you're in sociology. In Japan, there would be no problem about, I mean, I can write essays in what really would consider philosophy, and I can write things in sociology, and nobody sees this as having some confused identity. It's quite natural to move between those things. Possibly in Japan is closer to France in this kind of way, the idea of the kind of public intellectual who it was hard to classify. You know, is Foucault a philosopher, a sociologist, a psychiatrist, you know, I don't know what, activist or something? And it doesn't really matter. So that question of disciplinary boundaries is not strong. Behind that is the fact that if you look at a high percentage of Japanese philosophy, so this famous Kyoto school, I think you're familiar with, the roots of that are very much in Buddhism. I mean, a philosophical system is being developed out of essentially Buddhist worldview. So that permeates all sorts of levels of intellectual discourse. Again, I think not necessarily terribly visibly, but again through a kind of osmosis. The question of literature and society, I mean, I think you raise an interesting point. I mean, it used to be true in France, again, that there was a distinction between the sociology of religion and religious sociology. And sociology of religion was the study by sociologists of religious phenomenon. Religious sociology was largely a Catholic movement to apply sociological methods to, I don't know, churchy things, evangelism and whatever, right? It was a kind of applied sociology from the point of view of primarily Catholics, I think, were doing this. Of course, you can undertake a study of a sociology of literature in Japan, and many literary critics and so on, I think, are partly engaged in that activity, right? In the same way, a lot of art history has now become much more aware of the social context of art. It's not only a question of stylistics. If you turn the question round and you approach the sociology through literature, I think this can be extremely revealing. Partly for the reason I mentioned earlier, that what I mean by unself-conscious is that it's not somebody trying to be a sociologist. It's somebody writing a novel, right? Somebody writing poetry. But in the course of that activity, they are in fact commenting in very significant ways about the structure of the society without making that the agenda, but it's built into the way in which the literature is constructed.